If you want to land a lie, and that's what your big win is, then frankly, you should look at yourselves.
No, Rishi Sunak is into detail. I think people just know that. And that will have come across.
A lie is still a lie.
Starmer doesn't have a plan. So I think it does change the terms of the debate, and he better come up with some answers pretty quickly, because at the moment he doesn't have them.
Labour is accusing you of lying, and we're kind of entering this sort of gloves-off phase, I think, of the election campaign.
So we watched the debate with a group of voters. They all actually said they were less enthusiastic about the election, having watched, and more worried about what it meant for the country.
Hello and welcome to the Political Forecast. Devastating polling, the return of Nigel Farage, and more talk of defections. It was all looking like a truly nightmare week for Rishi Sunak. But then came the TV debate. Mr. Sunak claimed again and again and again that Labour policies will cost every family £2,000 in tax rises. And Keir Starmer failed to effectively deny it until the second half of the debate. Today, while the number is being repeated everywhere, over and over again, Labour says it's a lie. But like the old saying goes, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has got its shoes on. So 2 weeks in, are we entering a new, dirtier phase of this election campaign? Joining me in the Fourcast studio, Labour's Shadow Attorney General Emily Thornberry, the Conservatives' Home Office Minister Chris Philp, and pollster Luke Tryl from More in Common. And Luke, you were conducting research into how people reacted to the debate while it was going on and afterwards. What did they say? And what did they say particularly about this claim from the Prime Minister?
Yeah, so we watched the debate with a group of voters from Milton Keynes, and I think it's fair to say their overall impression wasn't great for either of the two leaders. In fact, one voter summed it up when she said, well, there was one of them who just didn't answer any questions, and there was another one who just talked over him. And that was the mood across the group. They all actually said they were less enthusiastic about the election, having watched, and more worried about what it meant for the country. But on the specifics, I think Rishi Sunak will be quite pleased with the way his attack cut through on Labour's tax rises, or the claim Labour would raise taxes, simply because we went back to the group at half-time, midway through the debate, and they said, why isn't Keir Starmer answering that? Why isn't he saying it's true or it's not true? He just seems to be ignoring it. And I think that led to the perception with the group that he didn't have an answer on it. So whilst overall the group was fairly unimpressed, I suspect it won't move the needle, there was the sense that Rishi Sunak had landed a blow with that tax claim.
Emily, were you watching at home going, why isn't he rebutting this? Why isn't he denying it?
I mean, I think it's difficult because the first question came from a woman who was having to do batch cooking, who was having a really hard time, and who was talking from the heart about how difficult her life was. And so, so he hears that, and we all kind of responded as human beings. But you then, before he was able to speak, you got the Prime Minister sort of going, no, like chuck out a lie, chuck out an accusation, have an attack on Labour. And you're then left with a moment like, do I spend my time, this really important moment, talking to this woman about how her life is and what I can do to help her and showing a bit of empathy? Or do I take the gloves off and kind of get involved in some unedifying spat with somebody who's just like cooking stuff up, who's completely desperate and who's just, I'm afraid, lying? So I think his first response, understandably, was to talk to the woman about her life and to be responsive to her. And, and then Sunak kind of keeps coming back with his nonsense about the £2,000.
But you're more experienced than him at this game in a way. The TV debate is a particular skill. You've got to be able to answer the question very quickly in a few seconds. You've got to have your line right at the beginning, not at the end. And he kept running out of time. He kept being interrupted because he hadn't finished his answer. And that's why he never quite rebutted that claim in the first half of the debate.
I think what came across for me was that actually he just came across as a human being told that you've got like 45 seconds to tell us everything about Labour's policy on health, to answer all the blinking nonsense from the Prime Minister and any attack lines and any other questions. And it's really difficult to do it in that format in 45 seconds.
The YouGov poll immediately said 51-49 to Sunak. There's a Savanta poll, I think, which has contradicted that and actually said Starmer won by a few points. You think it was a win?
Yes, I do. I think the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, was really clear about what we've done so far. Things like the national insurance cut, putting £900 a year into the pockets of the average working person. There's support for pensioners, the enhanced triple lock, really protecting pensioners, which obviously Labour have not matched, meaning that under Labour, pensioners on the basic state pension will fall into paying income tax. And of course, you got the point about Labour's £2,000 tax bombshell across as well. What was striking about that first exchange that Emily just referred to, and subsequent exchanges, was that all Keir Starmer really had to say was constant sniping and criticism of the government. And that's fair enough, he's the leader of the opposition, you'd expect that. But what you'd also expect is some constructive ideas about the future. Now, taking that first exchange as an example, the one Emily just mentioned, with the lady saying she had cost of living pressures, the moderator, I think, tried to push Keir Starmer like 2 or 3 times to say, what would Keir Starmer do in the future to help that lady? And he didn't have anything to say. All he had was carping and criticism. He didn't have any ideas. He couldn't say to that lady, I'm going to do the following, X, Y, Z, to help you. He had nothing to offer at all for the future. And it happened again on the immigration question, where Rishi Sunak said, well, we've got these people we're going to send to Rwanda at the end. I think it's the 24th of July. The first flight will go. So Keir Starmer, what will you do with those people? And Keir Starmer didn't have an answer to that question. So again and again, Keir Starmer was, lots of criticism of the Conservatives, most of it unjustified, but he didn't have positive proposals for the future in those key areas.
So if I was going to deal with that, do you see what I mean? So we've had a couple of minutes and we've had about sort of 12 or 15 different inaccurate accusations. Where do you start? So can I start with the £2,000? Because I think that's a new one. And what they did was they put forward a whole lot of ridiculous presumptions to the civil service at the Treasury and said, so how much will all that cost? The Permanent Secretary at the Treasury said, look, if we have to do this, you are not to say that this is independent civil servants doing this. And there's a letter out there saying, do not put this out as being, from us. It all comes on the assumptions you've made. And the assumptions they've made are things about their own policies, are wrong things about our own. So they gave them a whole lot of garbage. They come out with the most extraordinary figure, and then they go, aha, the Treasury say £2,000. To which we say, I'm afraid, it's a lie. It's an abuse. It's an abuse of public. I mean, these are public servants.
You say that now, but why didn't he
for.
say it last night?
Let me say it now. So it's an abuse. It's an abuse of public funds. It's an abuse of public servants. And do you know what? If they really want to do it, why don't they put their own policies to the Treasury as well and say, well, here, because we haven't got any. I mean, all of their, getting rid of national insurance, this new kind of dad's army for teenagers. We don't have any of that properly costed. All this stuff about, we're going to have this additional tax cut for pensioners. All of that, none of it is properly costed. And I can tell you this. When we put out our manifesto, we will put out a manifesto in which every single one of our promises will be properly costed, and people will be able to look at it. And frankly, we would be more than happy for the Treasury to look at it properly, but not the way that they have tried to manipulate civil servants. And I think it's a disgrace. I think that it is yet another public institution that this government are quite prepared to try to ditch and undermine just for their own private purposes.
Now, I must respond to this. I sat there patiently and exercised enormous self-restraint while Emily was speaking, but I must respond. So firstly, on this point about it's an abusive process, of course, the last Labour government did it when I think Alistair Darling was Chancellor, did exactly the same thing. So Emily's sort of false outrage, confected outrage, really cuts no ice.
But it's not true, is it?
But let me just deal with this substance. So there were 19 Labour policy commitments that were looked at. Now, those weren't made-up policy commitments. Those were policy commitments that had been made.
That's not true.
By. I didn't interrupt you, Emily. Made by shadow cabinet members over the last year or two. Emily, I didn't interrupt you. Please don't interrupt me. I've got the document in my pocket, which I'm happy to tweet after this recording, going through each of those 19 and its sources, which shadow cabinet minister made the commitment and when. Now, of those 19 commitments, 16 of them were costed by Treasury officials. One of them, the costing derives from a Treasury press release, and because it was covered in that, and another one comes from a written-up parliamentary question given by the Health Department. The 19th, the final one, comes from an extremely unreliable source, but one which we are prepared to accept, and that source is the Labour Party itself. So I think you can see I've described the
what you
methodology,
did,
which is completely reliable and completely accurate.
But what you did is you then added them all up.
Hang on, it adds up to £38 billion net of revenue raising over 4 years. That is £2,094, or in round terms, £2,000 for every single household at a time when they can ill afford it.
Is
that is the cost of a Labour government.
Is that how tax works?
Yes, you need to raise.
Is that the truth? That when you tot up all of those policies, you then divide it equally between every household in the country, and you say that's what each household in the country is going to be taxed.
So actually, the cost
is that the truth?
So the cost of the policy measures over the 4 years.
Is that the truth?
Let me answer the question. Is 58 billion. We then subtracted, and again these were costed, Labour's various tax raising measures, which come to about 20 billion, giving you the 38 billion figure net. And that was then to get the 2,000. You then divide that by the number of working households. So those who don't work, who are, for example, in receipt of benefits, were excluded. So the denominator was 18.5 million.
I get how you got the number. What I'm asking you is it true when you say it's going to cost every household, let's say they do it all in one go, as you're assuming, and then you divide up the cost between every household, that's how tax works?
So first of all, it's not assumed it's done in one go. There's actually underneath the £38 billion total.
Is it true that that's how tax works?
Well, it's the average cost per household.
So it's not true that that's how tax works?
Well, it is true that the average household will pay £2,000 in extra tax next Parliament to fund Labour's spending pledges, which they have not identified revenue sources to cover.
It includes things like, right, a golden hello for dentists, right? We've never said that. It's actually part of the policy that you've introduced, and you're now costing it again for us. Now that's just one. I have a list here of 11.
Hang on, Luke. Luke, I mean, the trouble. This is a bit like last night. For me, it was a word salad. It was like you didn't hear anything, but what you did hear was, it's going to cost you £2,000, and that landed
because it is going to cost that,
and that's why it's punching through, isn't it?
And it's a lie, and it's a terrible thing to do.
I've got a 24-page document in my pocket that goes through every item.
I mean, we are seeing in miniature here what happened last night, and I said that with no disrespect to Emily or Chris, but that's why voters end up so disengaged on this.
And it's something which the Republicans did. The Republicans introduced this of just stick out a lie, and then the other side have to spend their time refuting it instead of talking about what it is they want to do.
The truth is that in the debate and with the focus group watching it, Rishi Sunak was better at delivering a line. He is better at delivering a 45-second clip, which they took in. So they also repeated back to me in the feedback afterwards, does Keir Starmer have a plan? Because Rishi Sunak said it so clearly. So that and the 2,000 did cut through with the group. And it was a presentational thing. Interestingly, the group said, Keir Starmer, he seems a bit nervous. And someone else said, he seems a bit lawyerly, like he thinks he's in a courtroom and not doing it, in the way of a debate. The thing I would say, though, is it wasn't all good for Rishi Sunak. We had people saying, he's quite arrogant, isn't he? He keeps interrupting. Why wouldn't he let Keir Starmer finish? And they did like the fact that Keir Starmer would relate to the questioner. So they would often say, he empathised with that person. He told his own life story. So Keir Starmer wins there. The problem is that for most people, and bear in mind, only about 15% of likely voters watch the debates, they will see what are on the clips. And the clips will be Rishi Sunak on that £2,000, which will cut through, and Rishi Sunak saying Keir Starmer doesn't have a plan.
Because the YouGov poll also said that Starmer was more likeable than Sunak. Was that your experience in the focus group?
That definitely came across in the group. They said he was more relatable, he had more empathy, he was connecting with the people that asked the questions.
Because, Chris, isn't there a danger, and we kind of saw this in the Conservative leadership campaign, where Sunak was better at the debates. He often won the debates. I think he almost certainly won the Channel 4 Tory leadership debate against Liz Truss, but the votes went against him because people didn't like him and they often disagreed. Even if they thought he did better in the debate, they just disagreed. That's the risk this time as well, isn't it?
Well, I think ultimately the votes people are going to cast in a few weeks' time it's not a kind of popularity. By the way, I don't accept the premise that he came across as less likeable or relatable.
I mean, I have to say he did.
Okay.
I mean,
Well,
even when he won.
okay.
No. But I mean, no, it's not my opinion. We did lots of
Okay.
focus groups and polling on it. And the problem was people agreed with what he said, but they hated the way he interrupted Liz. They thought he was so rude to her, and that tainted their impression of him during that contest.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, I mean, I personally didn't feel that, but I obviously respect your sort of professional judgment. But look, I think when people cast their vote, they're casting their vote thinking about, what the politicians who are offering themselves for election have delivered, like the £900 national insurance tax cut, but they're also looking to the future. And the point that, Luke, you made about voters having the impression that Keir Starmer didn't have a plan. Now, it is true that Rishi Sunak said that quite a few times, but it was also apparent to me because in the way that the moderator kept trying to get Keir Starmer to answer direct questions and talk about what he would do. And every time she asked Keir Starmer to sort of explain what you do to help that lady suffering the cost of living crisis and so on, Keir Starmer would just immediately ignore the question and just start going on about how dreadful he thinks the government are. So the fact that voters got that impression isn't just because Rishi Sunak talked about it, it's because that's what Keir Starmer actually did, despite the best efforts of the moderator, who was trying really hard to get Keir Starmer to lay out what his plans are, and it was essentially, she wasn't able to get him to do it.
But just engage with my basic point is it's possible to win a debate but lose the election, because people don't like you.
Well, first of all, like I said, I don't accept that he came across as unlikable. I think he came across as someone who was on top of the detail, who's a capable executive, who's got a plan for the future, a plan that's working already and will continue to work in the future. And I think that is ultimately what people are really interested in. Not whether someone can sort of fake a bit of folksy humour or a bit of folksy charm about their childhood or whatever else, which politicians sort of do the whole time, don't they, as a sort of trick.
What? What are you talking about?
Do you do that?
That's just like, it's
Well, a lot of politicians do. They try and talk about their backstory to try and sort of somehow make themselves seem more like normal. But ultimately, like a lot of politicians of all parties, by the way, do this, and not just here across.
Do you
the whole,
do that?
Well, because my background is a scientific and business background, I probably don't tend to do it so much. But a lot of politicians of all parties do. I think what Rishi did.
Well, do you think politicians feel the need to sort of create some sort of fake bond with the voter to make themselves feel more normal?
I think politicians do it for that sort of reason, but I think what Rishi was doing last night was just getting straight down to business. And can I just finish the point, Emily?
No, please do.
And then do come in. But I think Rishi was just trying to get straight to the point. There was very little time, as you said, 45 seconds per question. He was trying to get straight to the point with what he's done for the country so far, but more importantly, what he's going to do in the future. And I think that is really what matters in the election.
Emily.
Thank you. I think that if you have a broad experience of life, I think it makes you a better politician. I think that if you come from Eton, or let's say you come from Winchester, or you've been to Oxford and you come from a privileged background, it doesn't necessarily make you a bad politician, but you have to work so much harder at it in order to understand the lives of people. And I think that it is perfectly fine for those of us who have had a more difficult and challenging background to talk about that, because actually it does give us empathy. We do have better understanding. Keir's family had to have the telephone bill cut off. I lived on benefits. I only had second-hand shoes. It's fine to talk about that. People understand what you're talking about.
But do you feel the need to repeat? I mean, it's really interesting, this whole question, and particularly I think with you and Keir Starmer, because a lot of the public, and we talked about this before with Luke, where a lot of the public think Keir Starmer is a privileged establishment guy. They think his knighthood is hereditary. You've got a title as well, and you speak nicely, and so people might assume that you're posh, and you're not.
I don't really have a title. Listen, my title is I'm the Right Honourable Emily Thornberry, who has been the Member of Parliament for Islington South. And my husband was knighted because he became a judge, and I'm really proud of him. But I'll tell you what,
the Tories take great pleasure in calling you Lady Nugent, don't they?
I have never been a lady, and I'm not likely to be one. And it doesn't matter being married to a Knight of the Realm. He's a great man, and I'm very proud of him.
But what I mean is, what's interesting is that both your examples, like you come from really ordinary backgrounds.
I come from a council estate.
But the public don't know that. Well, so you kind of have to keep telling them, don't you?
No, I don't have to keep telling them, actually. But I'm not going to be challenged. I'm not going to be challenged by somebody who tells me that if I ever do talk about it, it's some sort of fake, false, folksiness. Of course it isn't. If you have a broad experience of life, you are likely to be a better politician because you're likely to understand better.
Luke.
And if someone is telling you about how hard it is to be able to make ends meet, and someone is talking to you about that on a it's going to hit you in the heart, and you're going to want to respond to them as a human being, which is what Keir did.
You can be empathetic.
Just let me bring Luke in on this question.
But there is no doubt that when voters hear about Keir Starmer's background, they warm to him. But only we polled on this, 11% of the public know that he's the son of a toolmaker. We hear it all the time, but the public haven't.
What about Rishi Sunak's background as well? Because again, he went to Winchester, but it was a fairly normal middle-class background. It wasn't posh privilege like a lot of the Tories.
I think the challenge is for Rishi Sunak is because people know quite how wealthy he is now, it's harder for that to land. So we've tried testing that as well, when
he says, I worked in the pharmacy.
But the problem is that because people know how wealthy he is now and they relate that to the cost of living crisis, they're less willing to listen. I've described this election campaign before as Rishi Sunak needs to change impressions of him. Keir Starmer needs to introduce himself and make a good first impression, because we had people in focus groups last week who didn't know who Keir Starmer was, genuinely had no idea. And so I think Keir has more of an opportunity to tell his story. I actually think Rishi is better focusing on what Chris was talking about, being that competent chief executive, because people aren't going to buy the humble origin thing, and they do worry he can't relate in a cost of living crisis.
Chris, overall, do you think this debate has changed the game?
Yes, I do a bit, because as we said already, there are two things that came across really clearly. And normally, you get one or two messages that cut through. And the two things that have really come out of this are the point that Labour's plans are going to cost families £2,000, and on some key issues,
you've got to stop saying that, because it's not true.
I think it is true. like cost of living. Starmer doesn't have a plan. So I think it does change the terms of the debate. And what's going to happen now in the next 4 weeks is journalists are going to start pressing Keir Starmer quite hard on his plans for A or B or C. And he better come up with some answers pretty quickly, because at the moment he doesn't have them, and he can't go through the next 4 weeks asking people to make him Prime Minister without having good answers to those questions like the cost of living crisis.
Apart. If things like let's see what happens in the next 24 hours with this lie about the £2,000, because it could not be on shakier ground. And, you may be feeling as smug as anything that you've been able to put out a lie last night by the Prime Minister, saying it again and again and again when he knows that it's not true. And over the next 24 hours, it's going to fall apart because the assumptions on which it was made are untrue, and you made civil servants do it, and then you said, despite being told not to do it, that it was independent civil servants. It is wrong on every single basis, and I'm afraid it says a huge amount about the desperation of the Prime Minister that he's prepared to. And if you want to land a lie, and that's what your big win is, then frankly, you should look at yourselves.
No, I spent the train journey from Croydon up here this morning reading a 24-page document going through each of those 19 items, item by item, and I can show it to you afterwards if you're interested. It goes through every shadow cabinet member who made the commitment. It explains what it is, explains what the cost is.
What I find interesting about this is that you want to go into a place as a party, the Conservative Party, where you're being accused of lying.
Falsely accused of lying.
Again, I think, I suppose my point is, given the history of Boris Johnson and the truth, isn't it quite surprising that you're prepared to sort of re-enter a debate about the truth? Or do you just think it doesn't really matter because it sticks?
Oh, it definitely matters. Of course the truth matters. And by the way, just to be clear, I resigned as a minister in Boris Johnson's government on the 7th of July 2022. I was one of the ministers who resigned because I think the truth does matter. And I also, in Parliament, voted a year ago, I was one of the Conservative MPs that voted in favour of the Privileges Committee report. That is to say, the report that found Boris misled Parliament. I voted in favour of that report. And so I think the truth is extremely important. And look, as I say, this has been gone through forensically. Rishi Sunak, Rishi Sunak is not the kind of person. He's details orientated. He's not the kind of person who goes out and sort of makes things up without detail. Boris did have a certain turn of phrase sometimes, but Rishi Sunak is into detail. He's into his spreadsheets, and I think people just know that. And that will have come across.
A lie is still a lie.
It's not a lie, Emily. It's not a lie.
Who'll just go,
it's not a lie. It's not a lie.
And you'll get the new one who'll go, let's go away and let's sit down with all the Tory special advisors and let's cook up a really big lie with lots and lots of details in, and we can send out people like Chris Philp and they can try and defend it with their 32-page document. It's still
24 pages.
Whatever. It's still a lie.
Okay.
It's not a lie.
I think we're sort of like, it's kind of what I said right at the beginning of this, that this feels like a new phase where you're saying things that
The detail is there.
are difficult to stand up as the truth. Labour is accusing you of lying, and we're kind of entering this sort of gloves off phase, I think, of the election campaign. That's also going to be played out in the other thing that happened this week, which is Nigel Farage's entry into the election campaign. What difference do you think it actually makes, Luke?
I think it could be quite devastating for the Conservatives. So we had a projection out before Nigel Farage entered, which was the Conservatives going down to 180 seats. It's actually one of the more generous projections for the Conservatives based on polling. But that was in part based on the assumption that the Reform vote would be squeezed. That during the campaign, people would focus on either Rishi Sunak is going to be Prime Minister or Keir Starmer is going to be Prime Minister. And that was much easier before Nigel Farage entered the contest. Because if there's one thing Nigel Farage can do with the public, it's cut through. He will make sure that Reform continue to get airtime and make it harder to squeeze.
Now, he claimed to me, actually, that he would end up taking as many votes from Labour as from the Tories. Is that true?
It's not true. If you look at the figures, and we've dug into this, for every 100 votes that Reform gets, they take 60 from the Conservatives, people that voted Conservative in 2019, and just 5 from Labour. So it's a net gain of 55 to Labour for every 100 votes that Reform gets.
Chris, there's rumours of colleagues of yours thinking of defecting. Do you think we're going to see a bit more of that? Of sort of people going, well, I'm going to lose, so I may as well join them.
Well, I certainly hope not. And I haven't heard anyone sort of say to me that they know X or Y person is thinking of doing that. I mean, Nigel Farage has run, this is going to be the 8th time he's run for Parliament, the last, or maybe even 9th. All of the times previously, the 7 or 8 previous times, every single time he has lost personally. I think most commentators and pollsters agree Reform are not going to get a single member of Parliament. And
That's not the point, though, is it? The point is the damage that they do to you.
Well, so the message that we're going to be saying to particularly former people who voted Conservative in 2019 who might be considering voting Reform, the message we're going to be putting out over the next 4 weeks is to say, look, if you vote for Reform, you risk letting Labour win MPs they might otherwise not win, letting Keir Starmer into Downing Street, and we know that the Labour Party are not that interested in issues like
but Reform are campaigning on
immigration.
That. I mean, you're not. Reform are literally saying Keir Starmer is going to be the Prime Minister. So, voting for us is accepting that Keir Starmer is going to be the Prime Minister. We're arguing about being in the opposition.
Well,
so you're not telling voters anything new, are you, by saying you're going to let Keir Starmer in? Because that's what Reform's saying.
Look, if there are more debates like this, the one last night, that could significantly change the weather. No one can take anything for granted. I'm sure probably Emily would actually echo that, I imagine, as well. Nothing can be taken for granted. This is about who runs the country. It's going to be Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak. And by voting for someone else like Reform, you are essentially absenting yourself from participating in that choice. And I think if someone is Reform inclined, the idea of putting Keir Starmer into Downing Street is going to be a pretty horrifying prospect.
Emily, I mean, it's good for Labour, Farage's entry into the election. There's no doubt about that. But you think he is a bad thing for politics, don't you?
So number one, I mean, obviously, since he said it 2 or 3 times, and I don't want to be accused of not challenging lies when they appear, this idea that Labour's not interested in controlling immigration is a lie. So let me just park that. I've now. So now can I move on? So Farage, I think what Farage encapsulates is the way in which the right of the Conservative Party is losing faith in the Conservative Party. And that's why Farage has the head of steam that he does, because he offers an alternative. So I think that, obviously it's very damaging to the Conservative Party because, I think that one of the reasons they probably called this election as fast as they did was that they hoped that they would get out in front of Reform before Reform had got itself organised and got all its candidates in place. And a lot of the policies that they've been putting forward in the first week have been about shoring up the right wing.
One of the things I find perplexing about this, Luke, is why populist messages still work. If you think that there is more buyer's remorse now for Brexit, and everyone has seen through the campaign bus pledges and all the rest of it, why is it still effective campaigning and methods with the same sorts of methods and people?
Well, I think it's effective because, you've got people in focus groups saying for the first time in my life, I'm putting stuff back when I do the weekly shop because I can't afford it. You're getting people saying I can't pay the energy bills. You're getting people saying we were promised that immigration was going to come down and it hasn't come down. And the net effect of that is not just to taint the Conservatives. And I always said this, it isn't just an anti-Conservative mood, although that is very strong. There is an anti-politics mood, which Nigel Farage is very good at tapping into. And the thing I would say is when you do a focus group with Reform voters, yes, they talk about immigration. That's number one. But beyond that, actually, they sound a bit like Corbynites sometimes. They talk about big business and the system being rigged and, politicians making lots of money. They are anti-system voters who want to shake things up. So it's less about kind of Brexit and what's come before, and more about we just want something different, which we don't think
And that
the
hasn't changed then, since the Brexit.
No, and in fact, it's actually worse because we did focus groups when Boris Johnson first got in, and there were people in the Red Wall, those seats in the north of England, who were genuinely excited. They would say, we're going to be listened to now. They like the idea of levelling up. People have heard us on Brexit. Speak to them now and their disillusionment is even stronger than it was before because they were like, well, we had Brexit, we had the promises, it hasn't happened. Now, they accept that the pandemic and everything else, got in the way, but they still say we were promised something different, we haven't got it. Do you know what? We're going to turn somewhere else this time. And that is what Reform UK are tapping into.
Chris, what do you make of that?
Well, I think the point that Luke made about some voters feeling disconnected from mainstream politics is one that we should take really quite seriously. All political parties, actually. And it's a phenomenon that we've seen across the Western world. We've seen it in America. We're seeing it in a number of European countries. And I don't think it's the right response to kind of sneer at those voters or dismiss their concerns. I think that's actually would be completely the wrong thing to do because these are our fellow citizens. They've got legitimate concerns about issues like immigration, the cost of living and so on. And I think we need to just reflect carefully on how we address those concerns, how we respect the views of our fellow citizens who think that.
Emily.
Can I just come back on something else? Because I think this is something that we've been wrestling with, which is, we feel an obligation to ensure that we do, as we go into this election, that we in the Labour Party are reasonable and responsible, and people criticise us for not being ambitious enough and not going far enough and our promises not being big enough. But what we're trying to do is everything that we say that we're going to do, we know where the money is, and there isn't a lot of money around.
You've all been saying in the run-up to this election there will be a wobbly week. Do you think this is the wobbly week for Labour?
Oh, listen, who knows? I mean, we're all going to get more and more tired, and there will be mistakes that will be made, So I don't think anybody's going to punch anybody, but, who knows? I mean, something will happen,
Like the leaders in the debate last night, we'd like to give you all the chance to give your closing remarks. So in just a minute, how do you think this week's developments impact the result on July the 5th? Luke, you start.
I'm going to go with the famous words from Theresa May, which is nothing has changed.
Really? That's interesting. So it was inconsequential.
I think the balance of Farage on the one hand, the debate on the other, just means no change.
It cancels each other out. Chris?
I think last night's debate is a watershed moment because that I hear what Emily says, but I don't agree with her. I've looked at the costings. The £2,000 number is detailed. There is proper research and substance and attribution behind it. That is a lot of money to take out of people's pockets at a difficult time. And that point about Keir Starmer not having a plan, not having answers to that question, how are you going to help that lady deal with the cost of living crisis? He couldn't answer that question. So I'm not saying the polls are going to flip today, but I think it is the start of a different conversation across the coming 4 weeks. And Keir Starmer has a lot of questions to answer. He can't ask to be our Prime Minister without having a clear plan.
Emily?
So I don't think that a lot has changed. I think that as the election goes on, it will be good for us to be able to be given the opportunity to explain in more detail the sort of things that we want to do. And I think that our plans, for example, on Great British Energy and on transforming our economy are quite detailed, and we do need to have a longer period of time to talk about how we're going to put our economy on a better footing and how we're going to make sure that people's bills go down forever. But listen, nobody's voted yet. Not a single person has voted yet, and we wait and see what happens in a month's time. But we will just keep going. and hope that we get the opportunity to serve.
Thank you all very much indeed. Emily Thornberry, Philp, Luke Tryl. That was this week's Political Forecast. Until next time, bye-bye.